The term Nationalist China generally refers to the government of the Republic of China from 1912 to 1949. Those were the 37 years after the emperors and before communism. When I talk about the nationalists, I'm referring to the leadership of China and its supporters during this time. This era was defined by conflicts against warlords, against communists in the Civil War, and against Japan in World War II. Most people know very little about this era of history, so it's easy for myths to spread about nationalist China. If you read or talk about nationalist China, you'll inevitably hear people say that the nationalists were so hyper-focused on defeating the communists that they neglected defending their country from Japan. They contributed very little to Allied victory in World War II, they were Western puppets, and that they were Han Supremacists. There are other myths and misconceptions, but I'm going to stick to these four today. Myth number 1. The nationalists were so hyper-focused on defeating the communists that they neglected defending their country from Japan. This is a pretty common myth about the Chinese nationalists. The myth goes that Chiang Kai-shek was mostly interested in suppressing communism and showed little interest in stopping Japan. Only after getting kidnapped by his officers did he finally, reluctantly agree to fight Japan. Oftentimes, this myth is accompanied by claims that the communists under Mao Zedong were doing the bulk of the fighting against Japan. Bonus points if the person telling you this myth refers to the leader of China at the time as "cash my check." Most myths and historical misconceptions are based on a kernel of truth. Japan was encroaching on Chinese territory years before China actually started fighting back. Japan had taken over the entire northeastern part of China and set up a puppet government. All throughout this time, the nationalist government under Chiang Kai-shek was fighting the communists. Then in 1936, Chiang was lured to the city of Xi'an, where he was kidnapped by generals Zhang Shuiliang and Yang Hucheng and forced to stop the civil war and form a united front with the communists. And it is true that the Chinese army did a lot of retreating during World War II. However, these facts need to be understood in context. Chiang's focus on the communists in the years leading up to the Second Sino-Japanese War were part of a greater strategy called first internal pacification, then external resistance. The communists were an internal enemy, while the Japanese were an external enemy. So Chiang Kai-shek wanted to deal with internal enemies so he could then confront his external enemy. There's one famous Chiang Kai-shek quote that sums up his mindset and the mindset of many other nationalists. The Japanese are a disease of the skin. The communists are a disease of the heart. Of course, communists were not the only internal enemy. The nationalists also fought against warlords and their private armies. Nationalist China also had to take time to build up its military and industrial might in order to be able to take on Japan. You have to remember that China was a very poor country back then, and not the great power it is today. Whether Chiang's strategy was correct or not is a different question, but it's clear that the man was committed to fighting Japan. The nationalists fought Japan for more than 8 years. Chiang Kai-shek could have surrendered at any point in the war, especially as many of China's major cities were lost. Japan's war plans weren't to occupy all of China. They were to quickly take China's major cities and then get China to surrender. Japanese generals thought that this would only take a few months. They captured Beijing, Shanghai, and then the capital of Nanjing. And China still didn't surrender. Throughout most of the war, Imperial Japan was still holding out hope that China would surrender. Some disgruntled Chinese politicians, led by Chiang Kai-shek's rival Wang Jingwei, even formed their own Chinese government in hopes of getting peace with Japan. So it's not like there weren't powerful people in China who were willing to surrender. Had Chiang Kai-shek wanted to, he could have made peace with Japan, and the Japanese might have even helped him fight the communists. After the surrender, Japanese General Yasuji Okamura offered to let Chiang Kai-shek use his soldiers to fight the communists, but Chiang turned down his offer. Myth number 2. The Nationalists contributed very little to Allied victory in World War II. When you think of the Allied powers of World War II, you think of America, the Soviet Union, and Britain. You might even think of Britain's Commonwealth nations, France, and Poland. People are aware that the fight against Germany and Italy involved many nations. However, people get the idea that the Pacific Theater was just America versus Japan. But for more than 4 years before Pearl Harbor, and more than 2 years before the invasion of Poland, China fought alone against Japan. The Pacific Theater in World War II lasted 8 years, and all that time the majority of Japanese soldiers were stationed in China. And while they fought the communists as well, their primary enemy was Nationalist China. You may not know this, but there's an increasing appreciation of the nationalists within China itself. The best example of this is the Chinese movie The 800, which shows the heroic defense of Sihong Warehouse in Shanghai in 1937, and the movie correctly depicted the defenders as nationalist soldiers. In addition to defending their own country from Japanese invasion, China fought Japan in nearby Burma, modern-day Myanmar. China, along with Britain and the United States, fought a successful campaign in Burma that drove the Japanese army out of most of the country. Chinese participation in the war meant that the Allies could use Chinese air bases. So during the Doolittle raid in 1942, American bombers took off from carriers in the Pacific, bombed Tokyo, and landed in China. In 1945, China began to go on the offensive, taking back territory in southern China that had been lost to Japan. There were planned offensives to take back the cities of Guangzhou and Shanghai, but the atomic bombs were dropped before they could happen. If China had surrendered, then all the Japanese soldiers who were stationed there could be used elsewhere. Japan invaded India in real life, and with more troops they could have gotten further into the country, possibly even bringing the country under the rule of a puppet government, which would have been a massive setback for the Allied war effort. Japanese troops might have invaded Australia as well. Japan could have spared more troops to defend their Pacific islands against the United States. America would need to send more soldiers to the Pacific Theater, soldiers that otherwise could have been used against Germany. Japan also could have invaded the Soviet Union. I think it's safe to say that China played a very important role in the defeat of the Axis in World War II. Myth number 3: the Nationalists were Western puppets. This is another myth that a lot of people believe. The West supported Nationalist China, Nationalist China supported the West, and that they were best buddies. The reasoning behind this makes sense. The Nationalists fought the Communists, and the West hated Communists. They were also on the same side in World War II. And after all, the Kuomintang, the ruling party of Nationalist China, was founded in Hawaii. Sun Yat-sen, the first president of the Republic of China, spent a lot of time in the West and in Western colonies like Hong Kong and Macau. It's often said that the Communists were the ones who really cared about China, while the Nationalists only cared about getting money from their Western masters, and that the West was super invested in the nationalist victory over the Communists so they could keep on abusing China like they had for the last century. This propaganda leaflet here shows Chiang Kai-shek as a monkey being led around by the US. The Nationalists did sometimes align with the West, and they weren't anti-Western necessarily. But then again, the Soviet Union was on the same side as the West in World War II as well. Chiang Kai-shek wasn't particularly fond of Britain, which is understandable if you know the history between those countries. He viewed America more favorably, though he didn't always see eye to eye with America either. Chiang and the Nationalists weren't content to let the West continue China's century of humiliation. Chiang Kai-shek declared the century of humiliation over in 1943 when he ended the unequal treaties the West had in China. He also convinced the United States to repeal the Chinese Exclusion Act. American opinion on nationalist China was divided. American General Claire Chennault loved Chiang Kai-shek, while another American general, Joseph Stilwell, hated him, and he was not the only person in the American military or government who hated him. The US wanted Chiang Kai-shek to make peace with the Communists and hoped that he might form a coalition government with them. Chiang, on the other hand, wanted to destroy the Communists. A lot of people working in the government or in journalism in Western countries actually wanted the Communists to win. There was also a perception that communism wasn't compatible with China, and thus Mao and the Communists weren't real communists like the Soviets. As the tide of war turned against the Nationalists, the United States reacted by placing an arms embargo on Nationalist China. It was looking like America was going to abandon the Nationalists in order to get on the Communists' good side so they could be turned against the Soviet Union. In 1949, Mao Zedong proclaimed the People's Republic of China, and Chiang Kai-shek fled to Taiwan. In 1950, Britain became the first non-communist country to recognize the People's Republic of China as the true China, and several other Western nations followed suit. America did eventually commit to the defense of Taiwan. However, the American government did not support Chiang Kai-shek's goal of taking back the mainland, and advised him to withdraw his troops from Kinmen and Matsu Islands, as these islands are very close to mainland China and historically were not associated with Taiwan. That said, Chiang Kai-shek had a lot of American fans, and there were always people in the government who supported the Republic of China, even if America's support wasn't anywhere near the extent that people think it was. So the Nationalists were not Western puppets. They weren't really pro or anti-Western, they were just pro-China. Sometimes the interests of China aligned with those of America or Britain, and sometimes they did not. Myth number 4, the Nationalists were Han Supremacists. This myth is worse than the others, because with the other myths, I can at least see why someone would believe them. It's often asserted that Sun Yat-sen, Chiang Kai-shek, and the Nationalists as a whole were Han supremacists, and no evidence is given. I guess it's just because they were nationalists, therefore they were racists. It's possible to be a nationalist without being a racist, and it's possible to be a racist without being a nationalist. They're two different things. The most famous flag of the Chinese nationalists is the white sun, blue sky flag, the one currently used in Taiwan. But before that flag was adopted, they had the 5 races under one union flag: a red stripe for Han Chinese, a yellow stripe for Manchus, a blue stripe for Mongols, a white stripe for Hui Muslims, and a black stripe for Tibetans. The Nationalists viewed minorities as an integral part of the Chinese nation, and their constitution says that all races are equal. Chiang Kai-shek put this into practice when he adopted a half-Japanese child. Both his biological son and his adopted son married non-Chinese women, and Chiang Kai-shek had no problem with that. In his victory speech, Chiang Kai-shek said that the war had been against the government of Japan and not the people of Japan. Ethnic minorities made up an important part of the military, and several nationalist generals were minorities. In fact, the nationalist soldiers who continued fighting in the mainland after 1949 were largely of the Hui minority group. Were there racists in nationalist China? Of course there were. There are racists in every country, but racism was not official policy. If you made it to the end of the video, that's great. I plan on going into more detail on some of these topics in the future. I also hope to talk about tridemism, which is the ideology of nationalist China. If you think that I'm wrong about what I said, and what I call myths were actually true, explain your reasoning in the comments.